Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Ponds mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at Doings of Doyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 29. Today we travel back to the very beginning and explore Conan Doyle's first published work, The Mystery of Sasassa Valley, from 1879. And here's Paul to lead us into the story.
Tom Donahue and Jack Turnbull are down on their luck. Having failed to qualify as barristers in England, they have turned to prospecting in South Africa, with no greater success. But one stormy night, their pal Dick Wharton visits them, with a strange tale of a red-eyed demon on the veldt. His fantastic yarn excites Tom beyond its intrinsic merits and energizes him into a bustle of activity. Jack is mystified until the night that he and Tom go out in search of the demon.
Now, we know a fair bit about the writing of this story thanks to surviving letters and to the work of Conan Doyle's bibliographers, John Michael Gibson and Richard Lancelyn Green. Sasassa Valley was written while Conan Doyle was still a student at Edinburgh University, although he wasn't actually in Edinburgh at the time. During his studies, he took the occasional apprenticeship with doctors across the country to gain experience and pay his way. And one of those he often resided with was Dr. Reginald Ratcliffe Hoare of Clifton House, Aston Road in Birmingham. Ratcliffe Hoare had what Conan Doyle described as a 5-horse city practice, which kept the young student working from morning to night. Conan Doyle got on very well with the Ratcliffe Hoare family and said later that his role was soon rather that of a son than of an assistant. And in fact, he enjoyed a long correspondence with Ratcliffe Hoare's wife, Amy, for many years. And it was in 1879, while he was working in Birmingham as an apprentice, that Conan Doyle was prompted to pick up his pen. And in his autobiography, Memories and Adventures, he wrote, "It was in this year that I first learned that shillings might be earned in other ways than by filling files. Some friend remarked to me that my letters were very vivid, and surely I could write some things to sell. The remark of my friend, who was by no means given to flattery, took me greatly by surprise. I sat down, however, and wrote a little adventure story which I called The Mystery of the Sasassa Valley. To my great joy and surprise, it was accepted by Chambers' Journal, and I received 3 guineas. It mattered not that other attempts failed. I'd done it once, and I cheered myself by the thought that I could do it again." Now, that friend that he mentions there, we believe, is Ratcliffe Hoare's nephew, Rupert, who was another of the doctor's assistants at the time, and he'd been impressed by Conan Doyle's vivid letters and also by some stories that Conan Doyle had written for Rupert's children, which, of course, sadly no longer exist. Conan Doyle's reference there to other failed attempts is worth noting as well, since Sasassa Valley, while it was the first story to be published, was not the first story to be written or indeed submitted to a publisher. The earliest submitted to a publisher, we believe, was The Haunted Grange at Goresthorpe, which was rejected by Blackwoods 2 years earlier in 1877. The manuscript for that was later discovered in the Blackwoods archives and published by the Arthur Conan Doyle Society in 2000. And it's worth just pausing on that payment Conan Doyle received of 3 guineas, because it might not sound like much, but at the time it was an enormous amount of money for a struggling apprentice doctor. In that same chapter where he describes the writing of Sasassa Valley, he says that he was given 2 pence for lunch every day, which would buy him a mutton pie or a second-hand book from the neighbouring bookshop. So 3 guineas would have been 378 lunches or 378 books, and I guess we've all been there with that decision. The Mystery of Sasassa Valley, subtitled A South African Story, was then first published in Chambers on 6th of September 1879. And the story appeared anonymously, which was pretty common for the journals of the day and a source of frustration for many budding authors. Although it has to be said, Conan Doyle didn't object when one of his early anonymous stories was mistaken for the work of Robert Louis Stevenson. And Conan Doyle's name was only really attached to Sasassa Valley in the 1890s when it started to appear in US editions, which capitalized on the success of Sherlock Holmes by reproducing some of his early work. Owen Dudley Edwards makes the point that Conan Doyle really prized this 6th September issue of Chambers' Journal and pored over it for the other contributions. And he makes the observation that the first article in that issue, which is on the rather dry subject of land transfer, has reference to the Dimsdale frauds, and he suggests that this might be a source for Dimsdale, the hero of the firm of Girdleston. There are actually two other articles that follow that are interesting as well. One of them, though, is The Brave Swiss Boy, which is a fiction translated from the German, which is about a herdsman's son living in the Bernese Oberland near Meiringen, which could well be an influence on the final problem. And the third piece in there, which appears immediately before Sasassa Valley, is called Glimpses of London, and is a description of walks around the city and many of the sort of locations that you would associate with the early Sherlock Holmes stories. And of course, we know that Conan Doyle based a lot of the locations in Study in Scarlet, the London locations in Study in Scarlet, on second-hand information because he was less familiar about London. So here's another possible source of inspiration, all coming from this quite amazing journal, Chambers' Journal.
Yeah, Chambers's journal was a real fixture of Edinburgh cultural and intellectual life. It had been founded in 1832 by the brothers William and Robert Chambers, who had both had separate bookstores in the city. Its first title was Chambers's Edinburgh Journal.
Hmm.
And this changed in 1854 to Chambers's Journal of Popular Literature, Science and Art, and then in 1899 to Chambers's Journal, simple, which I suspect people from 1854 onwards just called it Chambers's Journal
Yeah,
anyway.
yeah,
But this was one of two main Edinburgh journals, the other being Blackwood's magazine. Blackwood's had the greater prestige, but Chambers's sold more copies. And Conan Doyle was familiar with both these magazines, and his great ambition had been to get into
yes,
Blackwood's because of its prestige, because they really carved a niche for themselves as well, doing mystery and supernatural stories.
yes,
And even Edgar Allan Poe had been a fan of Blackwood's magazine. But as you mentioned, Mark, he submitted, it seems, in about 1877, the story, the Haunted Grange of Goresthorpe, which then we don't know whether it was rejected or not, or it just
no,
sat in their files. And I think, as Owen Dudley Edwards said, it might have been the simple reason that Conan Doyle hadn't put his return address
return
on it
address,
or
yeah,
any details, so they weren't able to get back in touch with him one way or the other. So that sat there, and that also casts a light. It's interesting with the wording that you've quoted from Memories and Adventures, where it seems Conan Doyle's almost doing a little bit of rewriting of his own history.
hmm.
When he says it mattered not that other attempts failed, I had done it once and I cheered myself by the thought I could do it again. His wording isn't it mattered not that other attempts had failed.
Yes,
He's making out that
yeah,
Sasassa Valley was that he hadn't thought about writing until he started writing Sasassa Valley. So it is this slight tweaking and reworking of history along those lines.
yeah,
But nevertheless, he did well
yeah.
to actually get published in Chambers's, because this was, it wasn't easy to get into this magazine, and to have this early try accepted and published in Chambers's it's a great success, really.
Yes, and Chambers just went on to publish great writers like Thomas Hardy, early works by Thomas Hardy, and I think George Meredith.
Yeah, both their first works appeared in Chambers's, so they debuted in the same magazine as Conan Doyle, or the other way round, perhaps. But yeah, and later on, Doyle appeared three more times in the pages of Chambers's. The Surgeon of Gaster Fell, which was published in December 1890. And later, The Recollections of Captain Wilkie, which appeared in the magazine in January 1895. Now, that's quite interesting in itself as well, because this is another early story.
Yes.
And I think it's Richard Lancelin Green speculates, had Conan Doyle found this story himself in his files, or had Chambers's gone back to their archives and found it and thought, "Oh, we know this guy now. We'll publish this." And I think that's the more likely solution
Yeah,
there.
absolutely. Yeah.
But he also published a real life crime story as well, the Bravos of Market Drayton in 1889. But that was his lot with Chambers's. And he only ever had one story appear in Blackwoods,
Mm.
which was The Physiologist's Wife, published in September 1890.
And that's an interesting story for him to have published in Blackwoods, because it absolutely isn't one of those mystery and gothic fictions that he really wanted to get in there.
Mm, mm.
And it might seem a little odd that Conan Doyle's first published story should be set in South Africa, of all places, but in many ways this was a very topical setting.
Yes, particularly 1879. This is the year of the Anglo-Zulu War,
Mm.
which had begun in January 1879 with the British invasion of Zululand, and it came unstuck pretty quickly with the Battle of Isandlwana on January the 22nd, when a British column was essentially wiped out. This was quickly followed by the smaller Battle of Rorke's Drift, where the British, in a way, redeemed themselves, and 11 of the defenders of this mission station, which most of us know through the film Zulu,
Yeah.
11 of the defenders won the Victoria Cross. Both Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift were huge news stories, and there is a cynical view which could say the Victoria Crosses were to distract from Isandlwana.
Yes.
And then later in the war, on the 1st of June, another disaster brought it really back into the news with the death of the French or Bonapartist pretender, the Prince Imperial Louis Napoleon,
Mm.
who was actually killed by the Zulus. He'd been going along almost as a lark, as an observer with the British Army in Zululand, and was caught on a patrol and killed by the Zulus, which caused a major diplomatic incident and major news story. All was kind of redeemed with the Battle of Ulundi on the 4th of July, where the British finally triumphed over the Zulus. But it was not the greatest of victories.
An ignominious
Yes,
instance, yeah.
nothing to be proud of particularly. But this brought South Africa very much to the forefront in the news. If Conan Doyle was writing The Mystery of Sasassa Valley in perhaps late summer of 1879, this would be very much in the forefront of the news, and he would be observing all this himself, and with his interest in Napoleon and so on, maybe the story of the
Mm.
Prince Imperial would really have caught his imagination. So perhaps that's why he set this story in South Africa rather than in America or Australia, and just to give it that topical edge.
Yes, yeah.
Again, Conan Doyle is in some ways ahead of the time by writing this story set in South Africa, because as a junior British official out in South Africa at the time of the Zulu War, H. Rider Haggard would in 1885 write King Solomon's Mines and really push South Africa and African adventure stories to the fore.
Mm.
It's also interesting within this colonial perspective to note that Sasassa Valley was published on the 6th of September, which is 3 days after the British diplomatic mission to Kabul had been massacred, launching the second phase of the Second Afghan War, which would then have another disaster, the Battle of Maiwand, at which a certain Dr. John Watson was badly wounded and invalided home.
In one of several limbs.
Mm.
And of course, Watson was meant to have been out in Ballarat in Australia, in the famous mining district. And the other reason why South Africa will have been in the news at this time was because of the immense interest and explosion of interest in diamonds. South Africa had been a Dutch colony since the 1650s, and then transferred to Britain at the end of the 18th century. Actually, it was lost during the Peace of Amiens, which we just followed in a Foreign Office romance in the last episode. before it was retaken by the British in 1806, and it became a sort of self-governing part of the British Empire in 1872. But it was in the sort of mid to late 1860s that diamonds were discovered in Kimberley, which led to this immense sort of rush of prospectors from the early 1870s. This was sort of exacerbated by the discovery of gold in 1885, in that same year as Rider Haggard's novel comes out, and shortly after the First Boer War, where the discoveries were creating enormous tensions between people in the region. In fact, the first diamond was discovered by accident. It was picked up by a Boer farmer's son, um, and the children used to play with these sort of ugly stones on the banks of the Orange River when a neighbour, Van Niekerk, spotted the stone and thought that it might be worth something, and took it back to London and discovered it was actually a diamond and worth about £500. And he then, the same Van Niekerk, had another great stroke of luck in 1869, and it's from all of this that these stories of fabulous wealth suddenly started to proliferate, and they were true enough in the early days. Diggers using picks and shovels could find diamonds lying very close to the surface, and it was said that you know, it could be a day's work for a lucky prospector to suddenly earn 10 or 20 diamonds. In fact, there's a story of a penniless Englishman who served one day in the area around Kimberley and uncovered a 175 carat stone, which was valued at £30,000. But also, what happened as a result was that these small villages, which might have had one or two settlements or a handful of families living there, suddenly became inundated with large numbers of prospectors, and it soon shifted to this kind of almost industrial scale exploitation of natural assets. People like British businessmen like Cecil Rhodes and Barney Bonato made their fortunes in Kimberley, and Rhodes established the De Beers Diamond Company in the early days of the rush there in the 80s.
And Owen Dudley Edwards speculates that Conan Doyle may have picked up information from South African students
Yes,
at Edinburgh, so he may have had some first-hand information coming to him about this.
yeah,
Yeah, the Diamond Rush attracted all kinds of characters to South Africa. I mean, you just look at Rhodes and Bonato themselves,
mm,
and Conan Doyle in Sasassa Valley. It's perhaps pointed that he makes Tom and Jack failed barristers.
yes,
These aren't a pair of rough diamonds, to coin a phrase, but they're ones. I mean, later on, I think it's Jack apologises to his readers that he's become a bit rough-edged himself
mm,
by the experience of being out in the diamond fields and mixing with some very rough characters.
yeah,
And we get this later on again in the Sherlockian canon, in the Solitary Cyclist, where Carruthers and Woodley
mm,
are these characters who come out from the from South Africa and from the diamond fields. You get the impression, certainly with Carruthers, you don't get his full background, but he's obviously got a bit of a polish about him.
yeah.
Whereas Woodley, of course, has no polish whatsoever. So again, I think Doyle is himself very interested in the mix and how this is kind of a social leveler.
Yes,
How you can get people from a supposedly respectable background can come out penniless, and people from the bottom of the social order can, as you point out, possibly make £30,000 in a day. So
yeah.
it's obviously great, a great field for a novelist to work in.
Yes, and I was reading an interesting article. I'll put a link to it in the show notes from um, Isabel Hofmeyer, talking about the mining stories that actually came out of South Africa. So the ones written by people in South Africa and then syndicated around the world. And she sort of describes two phases of the mining story. The first of them is the kind of penniless, down on their luck traveller who earns success through perseverance and luck, basically. And she says that in these earliest forms of stories with these characters, there's a lot of focus on that sole prospector, lots of legends and fables and superstitions and myths, which ties into the sort of ghost story element that we have within Sasassa Valley. But she says that over time, the stories that came out of South Africa started to replace the honest digger with what she calls the gentleman pioneer, who was more of a reflection of what was actually going on the ground, which was this the influx of corporations to actually, like the De Beers set up by Cecil Rhodes, to capitalize on this at scale, and she sort of brings in the gentleman pioneers as being a signifier, a sort of politening up of what was actually quite an exploitative practice on the part of the corporations coming in to make use of natural assets and indeed the local population as labour. And interestingly, Sasassa Valley sits almost on the changeover point between those two literary traditions coming out of South Africa, in that Jack and Tom are, as you say, this sort of rather gentrified types, but they've almost gone backwards to be the hard drinking types um, who are basically, when the story begins, contemplating leaving South Africa because the 3 years of promise has not really come true. So there's an interesting set of literary traditions there that, whether Conan Doyle was aware of them or not, it just happens that Sasassa Valley sort of sits into that aspect of the tradition. And while we're on the subject of the mining story of South Africa, you can't really go off this topic without talking briefly about the aforementioned Cecil Rhodes, who obviously, it's not so much the jury is out on him now. The jury is well and truly decided. But Rhodes, in addition to being a prospector and the former of the De Beer Diamond Company, which still exists to this day, he entered the Cape Parliament in 1881 and became the Premier of South Africa in 1890. And his tenure marked a period of huge expropriation of land from black Africans, but also essentially pushing black people out of the electoral system in South Africa by raising the amount of wealth required to be able to participate in the ballot. Plus, of course, the formation of Rhodesia and very aggressive policies into neighbouring territories. And he was forced to resign in 1896 after the disastrous Jameson raid. And his career never really recovered from that. He had a very weak heart and died in poor health in 1902. I mean, one of the lasting consequences of his immense wealth, of course, was the formation of the Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford, and one of the very early beneficiaries of that was Christopher Morley, the great Sherlockian, and indeed I think his brothers were Rhodes scholars too. And Conan Doyle did make some comments on Cecil Rhodes, which now make very, very uncomfortable reading. He first commented on Cecil Rhodes in an edition of the Great Boer War in 1901, in which he said that Cecil Rhodes was a man of immense energy and one who has rendered great services to the empire, and that the motives of his action are obscure. Certainly, we may say that they were not sordid, for he has always been a man whose thoughts were large and whose habits were simple. And that sort of inherent naivety, which we've touched upon several times with Conan Doyle, really comes out in the next quote, which I found quite shocking, from Our African Winter in 1929, in which Conan Doyle describes going to Matopo Hills to see the grave of Cecil Rhodes. And he's almost venerates Rhodes in this statement. He describes him as a difficult man to appraise with our little human yardsticks, as though he comes from a greater plane of existence. And in fact, he goes on to say, heaven sent was Cecil Rhodes, and heaven guarded above all human institutions is that British Empire which he did so much to extend. So I think Conan Doyle, very much a product of his time, as we appreciate, but I think demonstrating an immense naivety around Rhodes and Rhodes' legacy, which even in 1901, let alone in 1929, was being openly questioned by some very prominent individuals.
And not just prominent individuals as well. It's a case in point that when Conan Doyle volunteered to serve as a doctor in the Boer War, believing the cause of the Boer War was just, he was opposed by his mother,
Yes.
who was very much against the Boer War and saw it as a war of imperial aggrandizement and
Mhm.
and almost a land and a wealth grab.
Yeah, yeah. It certainly casts an interesting light on some of Conan Doyle's other fictions, things like The Lost World, where you get a sense of a slightly more ambivalent view of empire. So the South African context comes out of the historical, but there's also a literary context to this story. And uh, being one of Conan Doyle's earliest works, there's plenty of evidence of him drawing on his childhood heroes and influences. And one of those that's really very pointed in this is Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah, it's like Sherlock Holmes. You can always, when you're talking about Conan Doyle, you can nearly always find your way back to Edgar Allan Poe as
Yes.
well. Um, and Essentially, the in its substance and form, the Mystery of Sasassa Valley is Doyle kind of reworking Poe's The Gold Bug.
Hmm. And of course, we've mentioned this story before in connection to the Captain Sharky tales.
Yeah, that's with the pirate element of the Gold Bug. And when you look at the actual story structure of Mystery of Sasassa Valley, it starts with Tom and Jack essentially hearing about the demon of Sasassa Valley, the red-eyed demon, which has been supposedly encountered by their pal Dick Wharton. And this sets Tom thinking because he's heard way back in his past a similar story
Mm,
relating to a 17th century Dutchman, Jens van Hoynem. And because he knows this story, Tom grasps what this might
mm,
actually
mm.
represent. But he leaves Jack in the dark. Very, very Sherlock and Watson, this.
Yes, very.
Tom thinks he knows what's going on, and he will not share this with Jack. And then they undertake this expedition out to find the into the Sasassa Valley, and Tom just brings Jack along, and a mystified Jack. Well, I'll go along. What's going on here? And then all is revealed, of course. And it's similar to the Gold Bug. With the Gold Bug, you have William Legrand wandering out on Sullivan's Island or near Sullivan's Island, finds the Gold Bug and parchment next to it,
Mm,
and just these are picks these things up. And then in the midst of talking about these to his friend, the narrator, suddenly the penny drops, and Legrand realizes what's going on here. And he does the same as Tom with Jack. He
yeah,
mystifies the narrator
yeah.
by acting in what seems a rather odd manner. And then once he's worked all this out, Legrand takes the narrator and his servant Jupiter out to go and find this thing, and they discover great treasure, and then all is explained again.
Mm,
It's a very similar setup.
mm. And that setup, drawn from Poe, is one of the things that distinguishes Sasassa Valley from these other fictions that we talked about coming out of South Africa, in that um, uh, Lucky Tom doesn't um, achieve his end through perseverance and luck, as was the tradition in the literature. He achieves it through deductive reasoning,
Mm,
and keeps the narrator in the dark. And there are moments that just leap out. I mean, that one when Tom realizes what is actually going on. Hurrah! Cried Tom. That's better. Whereupon he kicked the blankets into the middle of the room and began pacing up and down with long, feverish strides. He's got this almost Holmesian manner to it, and then that business about keeping his friend in the dark. The narrator Jack says that he's been quite mystified by his friend, but he says, "I had, however, seen so many proofs of my friend's good sense and quickness of apprehension that I thought it quite possible that Wharton's story had had a meaning in his eyes." Which I was too obtuse to take in, which frankly you could put into virtually any Sherlock Holmes story.
absolutely.
Yeah.
There's also very, very close incidents between the Gold Bug and Sasassa Valley. One in particular where Tom and Jack are actually out in Sasassa Valley looking for this glow, this
Mm.
what the natives of Sasassa Valley and Dick Wharton have seen as the eyes of the demon.
Mm.
And as Jack is sent to look for this thing, he says, "I had moved perhaps 20 feet, when in a moment it burst upon me. Through the glowing darkness there shone a small, ruddy glowing point, the light from which waned and increased, flickered and oscillated, each change producing a more weird effect than the last. In my excitement, I stepped a pace backwards, when instantly the light went out, leaving utter darkness in its place. But when I advanced again, there was the ruddy glare glowing from the base of the cliff." And this is similar to when Legrand in the Goldbug goes and sits on the devil's seat,
Yes.
and he says, "I put myself down to the ledge and found that it was impossible to retain a seat upon it except in one particular position. This fact confirmed my preconceived idea. I proceeded to use the glass. I moved it cautiously up or down until my attention was arrested by a circular rift or opening in the foliage of a large tree that overtopped its fellows in the distance. Having carefully taken the bearings of the tree, I turned homeward. The instant that I left the devil's seat, however, the circular rift vanished."
Yeah.
So,
Very
using
clearly
the
the
same
same.
trick. Yeah.
Very clearly. The other trick that I think you pick up on there is this one of the trick of the narrator, where at the point at which it's clear that Tom has deduced something, you shift into a different avenue of activity.
Mm.
It's a bit like, we might call it the Sarasate moment in Red Headed League, where Holmes has worked out that there's a bank robbery going on. We don't know that as the
Mm.
reader. The narrator doesn't know that, but he goes off and listens to Sarasate for the afternoon, and you get exactly the same trick here as well, where the moment that Tom works out something is happening, he sort of changes. He changes track completely. "And now, my boy," said Tom, "let's have some supper and a sleep. There's nothing more to be done
Mm.
tonight, but we'll need all our wits and strength for tomorrow."
And one other real area of similarity between the Goldbug and Sasassa Valley is this air of almost supernatural mystery.
Mm,
In Poe's story, surprisingly for him, it's not quite as overt as you'd
yes.
expect. But when he finds, or when Legrand finds the Goldbug, there's something very mysterious about this creature.
Mm,
And it's a combination of two real types of beetle, one of which has almost a skull
yes.
imprinted on its back, giving the whole thing an air of morbid weirdness.
Mm,
That's then the bug itself, and particularly with the behaviour of Legrand's black servant Jupiter, who's treats this thing with an almost superstitious awe.
mm,
You He builds up this atmosphere, and you have this in Sasassa Valley, where so many of the people who've seen this demon, or this red glow, think it's a demon. And for those of you who've not read the story yet, close your ears at this point, and then we discover that it isn't. That there's a perfectly natural explanation for all this. So both stories do that as well.
mm.
And of course, Peter Haining pointed this out, and it's quite right that obviously Conan Doyle will really reach a peak in this sort of story with The Hound of the Baskervilles.
Yeah. And this also brings us into the territory of sort of cursed gems or cursed diamonds too.
Oh yes, yeah. This idea that obviously this is another one of these things that Conan Doyle loves, and
Mm,
obviously we've got the Great Agra treasure
mm,
in the Sign of the Four, where there appears to be a curse upon that. The blue carbuncle, of course,
yeah.
is another one that seems to be cursed, and it's something that it's one of the staples of this sort of fiction.
And another thing he's bringing in from Wilkie Collins again, I think.
Oh, yeah, quite definitely. Yes, I mean the Moonstone really did change the game in so many ways.
Mm. And the other great literary influence that goes right back to Conan Doyle's sort of childhood interests is Bret Hart, of course. And Bret Hart, the American author, best remembered for sort of popularizing gold rush fiction. So another similar rush as this diamond rush that Conan Doyle is covering here. Um, I mean, Hart lived in San Francisco. He actually arrived 5 years after the gold rush, and he wasn't a digger himself. He was actually a school teacher and a writer. He achieved great publishing success in 1868. And in fact, a lot of it is put down to the creation of the Transcontinental Railway in North America in 1869, which meant that his works being printed in San Francisco and on the west coast of America were suddenly available on the East Coast as well. And he actually, in 1871, he traveled east to eastern USA, and then eventually went on to Europe, Scotland, and eventually settled in London in 1885, where he wrote some quite significantly different stories we might come on to in a little bit. But Hart's really remembered for this for these kind of prospecting stories, the stories of very much the sort of characters that we have here in Sasassa Valley, and probably the two stories he's most well known for are The Luck of Roaring Camp and Tennessee's Partner. And The Luck of Roaring Camp is about um, a prostitute who's working in one of these prospecting pop-up prospecting villages, as it were, and she dies in childbirth, and the diggers decide to care for the child, which miraculously survives a few months, and they call him Tommy Luck, which obviously has a connection back to the title character here. It's right in the first sentence of this story, and Hart followed this up with a story the following year called The Outcasts of Poker Flat, where he took one of the gambler characters, Oakhurst, and made him the main character of that follow-up one. But the other story that was really important was Tennessee's Partner, which was about two men only known as Tennessee and Tennessee's Partner, who stick together through all adversity. But what you get in this is Bret Hart created a lot of these sort of gold rush archetypes: the roguish outlaw, the charming gambler, the virtuous fallen girl. They all appear in westerns and indeed westerns of different ilks. They're in Star Wars as well, but also dialect. Very good use of dialect and sort of local character, localism, local color within American literature too, and that's something that very clearly influenced Conan Doyle in these early colonial fictions as well. And we don't quite know when Conan Doyle came across Hart, but we know for sure that Hart's first collection of stories, his first major collection, which was The Luck of Roaring Camp and Other Sketches, printed in Boston in 1870, was reviewed in the aforementioned Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine. And actually, when Conan Doyle was a struggling GP at Southsea, his mother said she would send him a sort of care package, which would presumably had a bit of, I think it had a bit of furniture and a bit of food, but also more importantly, books. And Conan Doyle asked Bret Hart for choice. And Conan Doyle had this to say on Hart when it came to Through the Magic Door in 1907. He said, Hart was one of those great short storytellers who proved himself incapable of a longer flight. He was always like one of his own gold miners who struck a rich pocket but found no continuous reef. The pocket was, alas, a very limited one, but the gold was of the best. The Luck of Roaring Camp and Tennessee's Partner are both, I think, worthy of a place among my immortals. They are, it is true, so tinged with Dickens as to be almost parodies of the master, but they have a symmetry and satisfying completeness as short stories to which Dickens himself never attained. The man who can read these two stories without a gulp in his throat is not a man I envy. And in fact, when Conan Doyle did his American tour in the mid 1890s, he at one point gave an interview where he said that he knew Tennessee's Partner and The Luck of Roaring Camp off by heart. So, this was a story that really heavily influenced him. And if you think about the other fictions that follow rapidly on the heels of Sasassa Valley, the American tale is a peculiar one in that it's set in North America, but has a sort of Englishman figure within that one. But the others are set in British colonial possessions in South Australia, South Africa, in the case of Sasassa Valley. And you get very much the sort of echoes of Bret Hart in The Gully of Blumenstyke or My Friend the Murderer. Particularly in The Gully of Blumenstyke, where there is a sheriff of sorts called Chicago Bill, who feels like he has been pulled straight away out of a Bret Hart novel. And the other two influences that I think you can feel in here are possibly a little bit of Mark Twain, another writer associated with the Gold Rush, who actually knew Bret Hart and hated him to the point where his lasting commentary on Bret Hart is quite something to read, and also Mayne Reid, who we talked about in episode 13 on the refugees as being a particular influence on that story. Conan Doyle did actually get to, I think, have dinner with Bret Hart in London, but doesn't seem to have had much engagement with him. And by then, Hart had moved on into very different type of literary output.
I mean, there are a number of points which arise from this influence of Bret Hart and Poe is this the way that Conan Doyle is so influenced by American writers
Yeah.
at this time. And started with Mayne Reid when Doyle was a boy, enjoying his adventure stories,
Mm.
and then going to more sophisticated levels with Edgar Allan Poe and Bret Hart, and this stayed with him.
Mm.
I mean, obviously, these sort of stories influence Study in Scarlet.
Mm.
There's very much that feel, the Bret Hart Western feel. That it's religious pioneers
Yeah.
rather than prospectors in this, but it's a similar sort of frontier spirit
Yes.
that's informing those, and this stays with Doyle through to, I mean, the Valley of Fear,
Mm.
1917. It's he's still interested in these sorts of stories, and the these communities, and the sinister undertow
Yes.
of these communities really pulls at him. And the other thing which you can really get, and we have touched on this already with the canon, is this idea of partners,
Mm.
and the buddy act, the double act, which he does bring to a degree of perfection with Holmes and Watson.
Yes. So in many ways, Conan Doyle was paying tribute to Bret Hart in Sasassa Valley, and the compliment would be repaid in one way, in that Bret Hart would go on to write a pastiche of Sherlock Holmes. He wrote The Stolen Cigar Case, featuring Hemlock Jones, which came out in 1900. And on the topic of Watson again, I mean, one of the other pieces of writing by Conan Doyle that relates back to, I think, Bret Hart is this rather obscure play, Angels of Darkness, the unfinished play, which has many connections to A Study in Scarlet. There was a lot of debate as to whether it was written before or after, and I think Chris Roden came up with the suggestion that it might have started out as a story that was an independent story, and then the Mormon section from A Study in Scarlet was added in after A Study in Scarlet. But that story, that play, unfinished three-act play, was famous because it has a character called Dr. Watson, who's a San Francisco doctor, and so there's been a lot of debate as to whether or not that was the first appearance of Dr. Watson, if indeed the play was written before A Study in Scarlet. The biggest sort of non-American influence on Conan Doyle around this time, of course, is Robert Louis Stevenson, and probably the most obvious connection there is with The Dynamiter from More New Arabian Nights, which came out in 1885. And you see evidence of that, being pulled into Study in Scarlet, and but again, similar kind of use of sort of local characters, local color, that kind of frontier landscape, prospectors struggle on the fringes of society. These are kind of the adventure novels that Conan Doyle, the adventure stories that Conan Doyle was really interested in growing up.
And Stevenson himself had actually gone out to that part of the world when he went to America, in pursuit of Fanny van der Grift, who would later become his wife.
Mm.
And he went by rail across the whole of North America from east to west, and spent quite some time in San Francisco,
Mm.
soaking up the atmosphere of that part of America at that time. And this all comes out in the Dynamiter, and it's in itself another hugely influential book. And Arthur Machen loved this book as well. And in his 1895 decadent classic, The Three Imposters,
Mm.
there is an episode called the Novel of the Dark Valley, which is very definitely in that same sort of territory again, and another homage to this sort of fiction.
Mm. So all in all, this is it's a really interesting piece of work. It's clearly apprentice work from a very promising new author, but I think it's got a lot of inherent merit.
Yes, it's a great story in its own right, and it's it's not entirely satisfying,
Mm.
unfortunately. There are gaps in the story where it seems to leap to conclusions,
Yes.
one thing where it is very much the opposite to the Gold Bug is it's a rip roaring race through story without too much explanation.
Mm.
And perhaps Doyle looked at the Gold Bug and thought, it's a bit long and there's a bit too much explanation, and so he was trying to avoid that. You do get the gist of the story. No essential information is really left out.
Mm.
So yeah, it's well structured and it's an enjoyable read.
Mm.
But it's also, of great interest because it's pointing the way to the future. We've got this love of these sort of adventure stories, which is going to come out more and more throughout the 1880s with the stories that you've been mentioning, influenced by Bret Hart, and you've also got this partnership between the two main characters,
Mm.
which really is pointing the way towards, the eventual outcome with Holmes and Watson. So it's a story that yeah, I would quite definitely recommend anyone really interested in Doyle and in Holmes, that they should read.
Yeah. So that brings us to the end of this episode. If you would like to find the show notes, they can be found at doingsofdoyle.com. And if you're interested in sponsoring the podcast, then check out our Patreon page, which is patreon.com/doings of Doyle. And we've got a special guest next time. So who are we talking to, Paul?
We'll be talking to Professor Douglas Kerr, who is the general editor of the Edinburgh Conan Doyle New Critical Editions, for which he has written an introduction to Memories and Adventures, Conan Doyle's autobiography. And this earned him one of the inaugural Doylean Honours Awards earlier in the year.
Excellent. And that will be a great conversation with Douglas. So please join us for that at the end of September. Until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye. I can give you diamonds.